Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and welcome back to another reading wrap-up. So today I'm gonna talk about the books I read from late July to late September. So basically a reading wrap-up for August to September 2024. And since the last reading wrap-up I've read 8 books. So now we are up to 26 books that I've read so far this year. So the first book I read was Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee, written in 2017, which is a historical fiction book of a Korean family who start out in Korea under colonial Japan in 1910, and then it moves on to Osaka in Japan in the 1930s, and it goes up all the way to 1989 in Osaka and Tokyo in Japan. So you basically follow several generations of Koreans living under Japanese rule for decades on end. And it's a very well written and nuanced novel. And I learned some interesting things by reading this novel. First of all is the concept of Pachinko itself, which is only relevant in the second half of this book. So Pachinko is a pinball game thing in Japan, but it's basically gambling because you win prizes and then you can convert prizes into money. And it's actually quite a big part of the Japanese economy. I think it's 1 or 2% of Japan's GDP, surprisingly. And the thing is, because Koreans have historically been discriminated against in Japan, they have entered this pachinko business, which has been seen as a kind of shady gray business. It's not exactly illegal, but it's certainly perceived as illicit. And it's very strongly overrepresented by Koreans, and a lot of rich Koreans in Japan are originally rich through the pachinko business. And another interesting thing I learned through reading this novel is that a very large percentage of the Japanese Yakuza are actually ethnic Koreans. I looked it up, I think it's something like 30-40%. And one of the main characters in this book is a Korean guy who is a member of the Yakuza. And he's always in the background, as you have this family who are experiencing hardship, and he has a personal connection to the main character, and you have him in the background trying to control their lives, which they don't realize until much later in the novel. It's a great historical fiction novel. If you want to learn about the Korean minority in Japan, which makes up, I think, less than 1% of the population, then I would definitely recommend you to check out this novel. And it's written by a Korean American woman. Next book I read is Japan's Story in Search of a Nation, 1850 to the Present by Christopher Harding, written in 2018. So, as the title of the book says, it's a history of Japan from basically Commodore Perry's visit to Japan in 1853, which opened up trade to Japan with the West, going through the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, Imperial Japan in the first half of the 20th century, and then Japan as a modern liberal democracy from the late 1940s onwards. And an interesting thing about this book is that it talks quite a bit about the psychology of Japanese people at various times. One thing that reading this book cleared up for me is that even though Meiji Japan was ostensibly a liberal society with its constitution, the Meiji Constitution of 1889, and the so-called Diet Parliament thing, it wasn't before the United States imposed the constitution on Japan, I think around 1947, that Japan actually became a liberal democracy. Japan had some liberal elements from the 1850s up to the early 1930s, but you still had quite a bit of censorship. Japan was also quite traditional. They tried to keep some of their traditions while modernizing. They were far from democratic. The people in charge were basically a group of oligarchs around the emperor. So although the emperor in theory had absolute power, it was more the cabinet thing in Japan that controlled stuff. So if you want a good introduction to modern Japanese history, I would definitely recommend this book. Next book that I read, which I've already made a review of on this channel, is The Great Convergence, Asia, the West, and the Logic of One World by Kishore Mahbubani in 2013, who is a Singaporean diplomat. This book basically argues that the rest of the world is catching up with the West through globalization, and that because of that we need to restructure international organizations and institutions to reflect that. And Mahbubani makes several good arguments about how the domination of some international organizations by the West at times lead to adverse consequences, but he's way too negative on the West in this book. And he preaches a kind of democratic system in international organizations to reflect the growing GDP and populations of Asian countries. But the thing is, one, this is written by a Singaporean. Singapore is not a democracy. And two, just in general, it doesn't make logical sense to say that a liberal democracy is morally equal to an authoritarian dictatorship that oppresses its citizens when reflecting their influence in international organizations. And anyway, since liberal democracies for the most part pay for international organizations, you know, the EU, Japan, and the United States, that's why they want more influence. It's their money. But if you want to learn more about that book, you can check out my book review on it. Next book I've read is I finally finished the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. So I read Dark Tower 7, The Dark Tower, which is written by Stephen King in 2004. And it's a big book. It's 600 to 700 pages, written in small characters. And on Goodreads, I gave it a 3 out of 5. And that is because the ending of the book is pretty good, and there are some cool elements throughout the book. Like you have Dandelo, which is a distant relative of Pennywise from It. But then at times, the book just meanders on. Like there is a big section of the book which is about conquering the beam breakers. But the large part of that story is just the security chief walking around with the boss, just talking and doing disgusting stuff. So it's a bit dull at times, this book. It's a bit bloated. You have a lot of interesting elements, like Stephen King makes a cameo in this actual novel. He actually criticizes himself for taking so long to write The Dark Tower. And the Dark Tower ending, very ending, is quite weird. But it's not a great fantasy series, now having read all 7 books. It's okay. But there's a reason I dragged reading this series out through a period of 4 years. I read book 1 and 2 in 2020. I read book 3 in 21. I read book 4 in 2022. I read books 5 and 6 in 2023. And I read book 7 this year in 2024. So it took quite a bit of time for me to read this book, because I'm happy that I finished this book series now, but I'm not sure if I would really recommend it. It is cool that there are a lot of connections to other Stephen King books, and The Dark Tower is the center of the Stephen King multiverse, but it also has a lot of flaws. And as always, this is Stephen King. It's bloated. Next book I read is The Tragedy of Liberation, A History of the Chinese Revolution 1945 to 1957 by Frank Dicotter in 2013. So this is chronologically the first volume in, I think it's called the People's Tragedy series by Frank Dicotter, which is a history of Maoist China. And Frank Dicotter is a Dutch historian who writes a lot about China. And yeah, this book shows how Maoist China already was very brutal in the beginning. It's not just the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution that was horrible, such as here, when you read on the back cover, 5 million people died during this period, 1945 to 1957, directly because of Mao. So you already had this forced collectivization thing, and you had a creation of different class categories in this time period. So if you were deemed a landlord or a rich person or a capitalist, you were evil, bad, you were a counter-revolutionary, and then we could discriminate against you, steal from you, or even kill you. You had these struggle sessions during this time period where people had to make fake confessions to stuff they supposedly did against the revolution. You also had this sick moment, I think it's around 1956 or so, where Mao said, okay, now everyone is free to express themselves and criticize the state. And some people cautiously did so. And then 1 year later, Mao used that as an opportunity to round up even more dissidents. And Mao also had this tendency that he would be quite vague about what he wanted. So you would have these party chiefs like Deng Xiaoping competing with each other, trying to outdo each other, killing as many people as possible to fill quotas and to curry the favor of Mao. And this is how Mao stayed in power, basically by making everyone compete for his favor. So as a power move, it's brilliant, but it's also pure evil. So when I read this book, in comparison to other books, I've read other books which says, oh, the Maoist years is nuanced. There was a lot of bad things like the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution, but then in the beginning they unified and stabilized the nation. No, the nation was not stable. Another sick thing that Mao did during this period was, because they were so scared of diseases, they killed all the dogs. Even when the homeowners said no. If the homeowner resisted, they would wait that the homeowner left his house in the city, and then they would take the dog, stuff dogs into cages, not feed them, and then let them cannibalize each other out of starvation. This is a hard read. It's just 300 pages of reading all the disgusting things that Mao did to China. So there are 2 more books in this series, but I don't know if I want to read 600 more pages of this stuff. I might just skip to reading Dicoteur's book After Mao, which is actually a 300-page history of China from 1976 to the 2010s, I think. That should be more pleasant to read. I already know that Mao was evil, so do I want to go more in depth on this? I don't know. There are so many other things you can learn about in history, instead of just how brutal some totalitarian communists can be. Next book I read is The Ministry of Truth, a biography of George Orwell's 1984 by Dorian Linsky, written in 2019. So this is basically a history of 1984. The first half of the book gives the historical background leading up to 1984 being written. The second half of the book is 1984 since Orwell died and this book was written. Because Orwell died, I think about a year or so after he wrote this book. This book was written in 1949. I think he died around 1950. But reading this book encourages me to read some other science fiction or dystopian classics, such as this book talks a lot about H.G. Wells, for example. It seems that H.G. Wells' original books had a lot of influence on Orwell. And also it talks quite a bit about utopian fiction in this book, because dystopia is an outgrowth of utopia. Because when you think about a utopia, it's a bit horrifying. Also because a lot of what people described at the time as utopias is actually horrifying, like collectivism, everyone is happy, sedated, doesn't complain. The utopias are a bit similar to what Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World, but as a bad thing. This book also talks about how 1984 has been bastardized in the media, including by the populist right in the United States, and how also the populist right is not using language correctly, which kind of reflects some ideas in 1984. And also that 1984 is being instrumentalized in really erroneous ways, such as there is a lot of supposed George Orwell quotes from 1984. I think there's one, for example, which is, "In today's world, telling the truth will be a revolutionary act." There's no such quote in 1984, but I remember that when I was looking into more populist right-wing circles a few years ago, that I saw this quote. So reading this book nowadays also means watch out for misinformation. So reading this book, you're also reminded of the importance today of fact-checking and being critical of what you read. And also that you should accept that there's such a thing as an objective truth, as the entire goal of the 1984 totalitarian state is to destroy the notion of an objective truth, that there are alternative facts, which no, you should try to work towards the truth. That's what George Orwell's entire career is about. You see, even though Orwell is on the left and a socialist, so politically he is quite far from me, since I'm, I don't know, moderate, libertarian right. But what you can appreciate about Orwell is that he sought the truth. He didn't try to lie with language and deceive just because it was convenient. He really hates the idea of expediency, which sometimes expediency might have been a little necessary, such as during the Cold War, but this is a good counterweight towards the idea of expediency. And this book clearly shows that usually it's important to be morally honest in your political analysis, which a lot of people nowadays are not, on both sides of the aisle, by the way. If you like the novel 1984, and if you want to understand it better, more in depth, have it broken down for you, understand its historical background, such as George Orwell fighting in Spain or working on the BBC, then I would definitely recommend this book. Also, there's a lot of interesting literary analysis of books written before Orwell that probably influenced him. Next book I read is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, and this is the first book in a series. So it's quite short, only a couple hundred pages and written in relatively big characters, but it's quite an interesting concept. So you have this basement coffee shop that you go to and you can order coffee, but there's this table where you have this ghost of a woman that sits there, but once a day she gets up to go to the toilet, and during that time, if you sit at that seat and think of a time you went to the cafe with someone else, then you can travel back in time to meet that person again. And it doesn't change anything in the present, but at least you can get some closure relating to that person. But there are several rules, and the fantasy rules in this book are quite well explained and followed. So if you get up from your chair, then you're brought back to the present, and if you don't finish your coffee before it's cold, then you replace the ghost woman and you become the ghost that sits at that chair for a long time until another unfortunate soul screws up. So I think you get, what is it, 4 or 5 people who go back in time in this novel. It's a quite emotional read that makes you feel content or good about yourself. It's a good novel to read because it reflects the human feeling of regret and also of optimism, because you can actually change your future. This Japanese book I gave 5 stars on Goodreads, so this is my favorite Japanese novel I've read so far, so I definitely recommend it. It's to the point, doesn't meander around, but it manages to be quite in-depth in only 200 pages. Definitely recommend this translated Japanese book, and I may read the sequels soon, we'll see. And the final book I've read is Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present by Farid Zakaria in 2024. So I actually got this book a few days after it was published, and lucky me, this is a signed copy. And this book is about revolutions and progress in the past 400 years. So it starts by talking about the Dutch Republic, then it talks about the English Glorious Revolution, which made England a constitutional monarchy. Then it talks about how the French Revolution failed because it tried to impose things from above and was too ambitious in its goal instead of the gradualist way that the Dutch Republic and the Glorious Revolution operated. It talks about the Industrial Revolution in the United States and Britain and how that affected politics, the growth of democracy, the growth of populism, the growth of polarization. It talks about also some modern revolutions. So the first half of the book is revolutions that happened from 1600 to, I would say, the beginning of the 20th century. The second half of this book is about the revolutions that have happened since the end of the Second World War in 1945, in the past 80-ish years or so. And these contemporary revolutions are in economics, so globalization. We all know that globalization in the world has reduced poverty a lot, making absolute poverty now just about 10%, and that a lot of the world has caught up with the West. You also have a technology, information revolution, and this includes, the internet, computers, being able to fly with planes, containers, which makes shipping cheaper. Then there's also a revolution in identities. So you had this happen in the 1960s in the United States and in Europe in the 1970s, where abortion became acceptable, homosexuality became increasingly acceptable, rights for blacks and women improved in the United States, but you also had a backlash to this, and you had the beginning of polarization, because the political spectrum here from the late 19th century to, the late 20th century, the right and left was mainly about economics, but that began to change towards the end of the 20th century to being one about culture, because initially during the post-war period you had a consensus on economics that was kind of left-wing, and then that consensus shifted to neoliberalism in the 90s. So Zakaria argued that the way that the right tried to separate itself from the left in the United States was through the culture war. So being more religious, caring more about being pro-life, being more skeptical about equity or equality or whatever. Yeah, it's clear at times that Zachariah has some left-wing bias in this book, but at heart he's still a center-left liberal who appreciates the importance of individualism and globalization and openness. And this book actually quite well explains a lot of the problematic things with the Republican right nowadays. Like, a thing I learned about reading in this book was that a very large percentage of Republicans actually bought into the lie that Obama was a Muslim who's not an American. And also a majority of Republicans believe the election was stolen in 2020, which it wasn't. But the final revolution Zachariah talks about is in geopolitics. So, you know, the Great Convergence, the rest of the world is rising. So initially you had American dominance from 1945 to the unipolar moment in the 1990s to, I don't know, around 2010. Since then you have the group of rising middle powers. You have had China being the biggest among them, the second great power. You've had the comeback of Russia, which has invaded Ukraine. So the United States has tried to build a rule-based international order that's been relatively liberal, but now that has been undermined by rising powers in part, and also by contradictions at home, polarization, which kind of supports isolationism and the United States breaking rules. And the conclusion of this book is called The Infinite Abyss, and it's Zachariah reflecting on the current state of affairs. And it talks about how sometimes progress can go too fast, but the backlash is almost always counterproductive. Like, because France tried to repress the rise of freedom in the 18th century, that's why you had the bloody French Revolution, compared to Britain, which had a relatively peaceful opening up during the 18th and 19th centuries. So I don't agree with all of Zachariah's solutions. They're a bit too left-wing for me at times. Also, he emphasizes a lot more how problematic the populist right is, but in the United States, both sides nowadays are quite problematic. Now, Zachariah briefly talks about how, yeah, it's a bad thing that a lot of left-wing people don't accept free speech. But he also underappreciates the fact that the left in the United States is going too far on culture. So the problem in the United States nowadays with the 24 elections, think of the two options. On the Democrat side, you have someone who, on foreign policy, is relatively good. So higher tariffs, but not that much. And promoting the liberal international order, promoting democracy, institutions like NATO, that's good. But the problem is on domestic policies, they're undermining the American family. They're undermining faith in the American nation. I'm talking about they're undermining civic nationalism, not ethnic nationalism or whatever. They're rejecting objective truth in part by rejecting biology. So that's the problem with the left. And then you have the right, which economically nowadays, yeah, it's bad with protectionism. They want to dismantle the international order. That's also bad. But at least they kind of believe in American culture and the family. Now, this is the United States specifically. The populists in Europe are way worse than the populists in the United States because they're far more illiberal in Europe than in the United States. And you really have a bad situation in 2024 because on one side you have Republicans who reject the legitimacy of the 2020 elections, which is worrisome. And you also had January 6th, which it has been overblown what it is, but it's still pretty bad that you had a riot about this. So you have one side not accepting the legitimacy of elections anymore, and then you have the other that wants to pack the Supreme Court, wants to act through executive action, and also wants to destroy the federalist tradition of the United States. But overall, this is a pretty sensible book. And because he doesn't write in an antagonistic way, it makes me more open to his ideas, even though at times I don't agree with him. So I definitely recommend The Age of Revolutions by Fareed Zakaria. I've only read this book by him. I may want to read other books by him. So definitely a worthwhile read. And also an interesting liberal history of the world, which actually shows that the world has moved mostly in a forward direction in the past 500 years. You've had some bumps, really bad bumps. But Zachariah implies that as long as we don't give up faith in our vision, then things will work out. It's no guarantee, but it's a possibility. We're not doomed. So this is a lot more sensible book to read than something like The Accidental Superpower by Peter Cian, which basically says, yeah, we're all screwed, except a few countries for some reason. So those were the 8 books I've read in the past 2 months. I'm reading more and more about Asia, as you can see. Let me know if you think there's any other books I would be interested to read. But otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.